Charles Manson and his so-called family would become the most infamous killers of the 20th century.
The victims died in the worst way.
Committing a series of brutal and seemingly senseless crimes that would spell the end of the 1960s hippie dream.
They were vicious, just horrible killings.
But what made Manson the man he was?
He was a very powerful person. When he said jump, they jumped.
How did so many young people fall under his spell?
Charlie would talk about how he was Jesus and the devil all in one.
And were Manson and his followers born to kill?
August 8, 1969, I was a Los Angeles police officer working West Los Angeles Division, and I received a radio call at about 9 o'clock in the morning from a man down at Cielo Drive. I wasn't expecting what I saw when I got to that house.
In a scene described by one investigator as reminiscent of a weird religious rite, 5 persons, including actress Sharon Tate, were found dead at the home of Miss Tate and her husband, screen director Roman Polanski. Miss Tate was 8 months pregnant.
I was the first one there. When I entered the house, everybody was dead. The word pig written on the front door in somebody's blood. It was very gruesome.
Detective Sergeant Mike McGann was assigned the case.
When I arrived on the scene, there was some wires that were cut over a large gate. I entered the driveway and found a car parked about center driveway, which contained Stephen Parent.
18-year-old Stephen Parent had been leaving after a visit to the property's caretaker.
And I went inside and I discovered Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring.
26-year-old Sharon Tate had been renting the Bel Air home. Celebrity hairdresser Jay Sebring had been visiting the 8.5-month pregnant actress.
Sharon was terribly stabbed, and they were tied together with a rope which was tossed over a rafter in the house. I continued on through the back door, and I found Abigail Folger.
25-year-old coffee heiress Abigail Folger was a house guest of the Polanskis.
Abigail had been stabbed numerous times. She was very bloodied and obviously dead. And I also found Wojciech Frykowski.
Folger's lover, Frykowski, was a friend of Polanski from Poland.
Wojciech had also been struck with the gun that they used. It was a terrible scene. I had been working homicide for a long time, so I had seen a lot of scenes, but I don't think any quite as bad as this one.
Polanski was in Europe at the time. Of course, he dashed back when he found out that his young pregnant wife had been murdered, and held probably one of the most moving news conferences, by the way, that I've ever attended. The man was just a wreck.
The house is open now. You see a lot of blood all over the place. Cradles, baby clothes, and that's all.
Of course, the husband can be a suspect, and so we wanted to talk to Roman, and he agreed to take a polygraph the next morning at our crime lab. And I was there with a polygraph examiner. He passed with flying colors. There was no question he was not part of the homicide.
Nobody knew who did it. Nobody had a clue, and Hollywood just went nuts. People were buying guard dogs, and they were buying guns.
Oh, LA panicked.
All these movie stars, they were hiring guards and off-duty police, anybody that could get to the house. I mean, it was a complete panic in the Hollywood area.
And the next night, the killing continued. Businessman Lino LaBianca and his wife Rosemary were stabbed to death in their home. Again, messages were written in blood.
After the LaBiancas were murdered the next day, it really started hot and heavy.
There was a lot of fear and paranoia here in L.A., particularly in the movie colony. Why? Well, not just because the murders were incredibly gruesome, total of 169 stab wounds, but they seemed to be random.
Despite a massive police operation, investigators were unable to identify a perpetrator.
We did everything we do. I mean, we had everybody we could possibly think of working on the case, doing every possible thing. Every lead we had, we exhausted.
Then, 3 months after the murders, detectives got word that a young Californian girl had made an extraordinary jailhouse confession. A story so strange, it was almost unbelievable.
It was a crazy story. Yeah, it was very crazy. Susan was the nicest person you ever want to meet. Talking to her in that period of time, you would think it was impossible. I mean, she was just a very nice young lady.
21-year-old Susan Atkins had claimed to cellmates that she and a group of her friends were responsible for the terrible crimes.
If these were typical murderer types, or robbers, or rapists, or burglars, it would have been quite as shocking. But they started looking at the backgrounds of these people.
Most of them came from good middle-class families in the suburbs.
Leslie Van Houten was a homecoming queen. Tex Watson was a star athlete.
Patricia Krenwinkel sang in the church choir. At one time she wanted to become a nun.
These seemingly all-American kids had become unrecognizable to their families.
She was like a stranger to...
Controlled by an unlikely but powerful puppet master.
This Charles Manson, this Mephistophelian guru type, who was very charismatic, very intelligent.
35-year-old ex-convict Charles Manson commanded an unerring devotion from his hippie disciples. They would kill seemingly at his whim.
He did control them, and when he said jump, they jumped.
The name Charles Manson would become synonymous with evil. But who was this diminutive guru? And how was he able to convince his young devotees to commit frenzied, bloody murder?
New from Magnum, a smooth chocolate. Wednesday on Channel 5.
Over 2 nights in August 1969, actress Sharon Tate and 6 others had been slain in one of the century's most infamous crimes. The killers were a group of young, seemingly middle-class flower children, acting on behalf of their spiritual leader, 35-year-old ex-convict Charles Manson. But just who was this powerful guru?
Manson was to have been born as an unwanted, illegitimate child of a young prostitute.
Disowned at birth, pretty much, raised by relatives.
He grew up in a very tight situation.
It's been claimed that Manson's mother once tried to sell her infant son to a childless waitress in return for a pitcher of beer.
From an early age, he was left to his own devices, got involved in delinquent/criminal activities.
When you grow up on the street, particularly if you're short and slight, like Manson is, you have to be able to learn how to read people very, very quickly and determine who you can get over on and who you can't. And Manson was excellent at that.
From the mid-1940s onwards, a raft of thefts and armed robberies would see the young Manson pass through several institutions where he was said to be sexually brutalized.
What comes through, certainly looking at all the psychiatrist reports and probation reports of Charles Manson, there was heaps of potential there. But something had happened early in life, and this dogged him the whole time. He felt he'd been dealt a bad hand.
By the 1950s, in his rare periods of freedom, Manson expanded his criminal repertoire to include pimping young women from a Hollywood apartment.
The qualities that a pimp has to entrap, intimidate, extort, run the life of their prostitutes, rent them out, sell them, and so forth. Those are qualities that stood Manson well in his future criminal career.
Incarcerated again in 1960 and facing a lengthy sentence, Manson began to study new ways of thinking.
When he was in Terminal Island, there was a Scientologist. Manson picked up on this, and he did 150 hours of auditing, which is the Scientology term for counselling. And Manson started writing songs. What he was doing, which is quite revolutionary for the time, he started imbuing these songs with much of the philosophies that he was picking up from Scientology and also from his observations of human nature. So I think certainly Manson, at that point, he's actually left the persona of the petty criminal and he's coming into his own.
There's a time for the
Fellow convict Phil Kaufman would encounter Manson in early 1967.
I was arrested importing, smuggling, if you will, so a little bit of weed from Mexico. I was convicted in Arizona and sent to Terminal Island, California, where my first day of the yard I heard this guy playing guitar and singing. He sounded a little like Frankie Lane at the time.
Look at your game, girl. What a magic.
I thought the guy was pretty good. The hack, the guard, came up to Charles and said, Manson, you can't play your guitar here. There's a guitar place for playing the guitar. He says, you know, you ain't never going to get out of here, Manson. And Charlie said, out of where, man? And he kept on going playing this guitar.
Part of the Manson that the public came to know was a very institutionalized person who was used to being told what to do and felt more comfortable in a confined or isolated place.
When you have an individual like Manson who doesn't fear any type of punishment, really, he's a very dangerous individual.
If someone beats you with a whip and you love the whip, what's he doing? He's making a fool out of himself. It's heaven right here, Jack, right here.
Charles Manson had been imprisoned in 1960. When he was eventually released 7 years later, the world was a very different place.
We had just come out of the 50s, where teenagers were basically kept on a very tight leash, and then all of a sudden this wonderful subculture erupted, and we all became free.
The 32-year-old guitar-playing ex-con headed to the eye of the storm.
There were thousands of young people all up and down this street, and this was all the psychedelic scene.
Dr. David Smith founded the neighborhood's famous free medical clinic.
1967 was totally crazy. The streets were jammed, people were taking LSD and dancing and music everywhere. We had the diggers giving out free food, and it was just a total insanity, and we were in the middle of it. We did a survey of the thousands of kids that came through our clinic, and 98% of them had used LSD.
Charlie saw a good thing when he realized that if somebody ran around and talked like a guru, in that day and age, especially up in San Francisco, you could gather a group of followers in no time.
you're taught that you can't. They even teach you the words. They give you the words. Take all the words away. And don't think in right and wrong, just think in truth.
Among those to fall under Manson's spell were librarian Mary Bruner, disaffected teenager Lynette Fromm, and 19-year-old drifter Susan Atkins.
She had a tough start in life. On top of a broken home, Susan Atkins had to suffer the death of her mother from cancer. And she was, come puberty, pretty wild. So wild that her family couldn't contain her. And like many others, she headed off to San Francisco, where she worked variously as a waitress and as a topless go-go dancer. She came across Manson quite early on in the history of the Manson family, and he was able to assume a fatherly role with her, which is a template for what went on with the other girls.
Also joining the group in 1967 would be 20-year-old Patricia Krenwinkel, later renamed by Charlie as Katie.
She had a troubled childhood in as much she suffered from an overt problem with body hair, which, as anyone knows, has come through the teenage thing that can really screw someone up. And her sister was a heavy drug user. She dominated the family, so Patricia really was a forgotten child.
Patricia Krenwinkel talked about meeting Charlie, and she met him down at the beach, and he took her to an apartment and had her take off all her clothes and look at herself in a full-length mirror and say, "Isn't that the most beautiful thing you've ever seen?"
Pretty, pretty girl. Cease to exist. Just come and say you love me.
And that's it. He got her. She was his after that.
Come on, you can't be.
Like many communal groups of the 60s, Manson and his girls got an old school bus and began roaming California. On his release from prison, Phil Kaufman joined up with the group in Topanga Canyon.
Never learned not to love you.
It was, it was incredible. It was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Real sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was sex on demand. It was, I mean, if I just gotten out of prison, and you're pretty girls, you just want to get laid. That's a good day at the office. The music was the seduction. And you get the new girls, some new girl who'd run away. It was good. And the girls would all sit and, play their little instruments, and that usually worked. That was the hook. It got them in.
Phil Kaufman would introduce Manson to a number of music producers, including Doris Day's son, Terry Melcher. Manson hoped to get a major recording contract and introduce his songs to the world.
Remember that a lot of people had not heard this type of music before, and Manson was not that savvy to the industry, media industry, music industry BS at the time. If they said to him, "Charlie, it's brilliant, we love it, we'll be in touch," he believed they meant it.
They may have worn bell-bottom powers and long hair, but they were businessmen, and Charlie and the family were hippies, and they wanted to do hippie music, and it was just total chaos. It was just, the recording sessions were terrible. But Charlie always kept pursuing a professional recording.
As a child, Manson had been rejected by his mother. Now the LA music industry would do the same.
It became evident to me that there was trouble in paradise.
Let's make some real flow history.
Channel 5.
In 1967, after spending over half his life in institutions, 32-year-old petty criminal Charles Manson had been released into a brave new world. Gathering a small band of admiring followers in San Francisco, Manson and the group began roaming the state, picking up new recruits along the way. In Los Angeles, 16-year-old Barbara Hoyt was just one of many young people they attracted.
He was definitely a father figure to everybody. I admired him. He was a very charismatic person. Everybody gave me lots of attention. They're all very nice to me. I think the acceptance I felt was a very strong draw, and I think that was probably one of the main draws to the cult, and probably anybody.
Within a few weeks, Barbara would move with her new family to a run-down film set in the hills outside Los Angeles, a location that would become infamous.
Oh, man. It's a heavy feeling here. It was just such evil that came out of here. It's such a pretty place. My God. I can smell the same smell of those trees. I can see where the ranch was down in front of me. Over there was the corral, and back here was the barn, and in front of the barn was the movie set. It just seems so surreal. It's almost like it was a long ago dream instead of reality.
At the ranch,